the most important role that we have may be creating our successors, as is the most important role, perhaps for many of us, we feel that
that's right.
Creating our children and having them go on to do great
Certainly.
things, perhaps is the most important part that we played. This may be true for our species as well. But if so, the idea that we just handed the flame over to the very first system that we can create seems a bit crazy.
Insane.
If we take seriously the idea that this handing over is the most important thing humanity ever does, and the 10,000 years of civilization that led to this moment is just a kind of prelude to this moment, surely we really want to think it through. So the more that one puts pressure on this idea that could be really good, the more it also suggests that this is a time for kind of, taking great care.
This is Daniel Fagella. You're tuned in to The Trajectory, and this is our 7th episode in the AGI Governance series. This series capped off with Eliezer Yudkowsky many months ago, but we will have occasional AGI Governance episodes when we have a good guest and a good topic, and this week we certainly have both. Many of you would know Toby Ord. He's a senior research fellow at Oxford, author of this tremendous book, The Precipice, and a pivotal thinker on sort of the key trends that are driving elements of AGI risk. The Precipice is a great book in that it also conceives of kind of more cosmic futures. We touch a little bit on that in this episode. We focus primarily on what sorts of trends have changed since The Precipice was written. This was written before the LLM wave. So what are the new factors that influence, in Toby's mind, the near-termness or long-termness of different components of AGI risk, and how should we take that into account for governance? I'll save my thoughts on this episode for the end of this episode as usual, but without further ado, it's a real pleasure to record with Toby. I hope you enjoy it. This is Toby Ord here in The Trajectory.
So Toby, welcome to the show.
It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, glad to finally be able to connect. We've certainly had many people reference the long reflection sort of idea in various and sundry interviews. And I know we have listeners that have asked, when do you talk to Toby? So for those of you, he's here now. And we get to talk about sort of what's changed. I mean, you've written a lot about this. This isn't something you just started thinking about 2 years ago. This is something you've given thought with for many, many years. And I'm interested in how the AI risk landscape has shifted for you. When The Precipice was written, obviously LLMs were not sort of the main game in town. And how could anybody have predicted that? A lot more has happened. What fundamentally has changed for you in the AI risk landscape?
Yeah, so I wrote my book, finished the text in 2019, and it came out in 2020. And so over the last 5 or so years, so much has changed. So let me cast our minds back to 2019. The biggest breakthroughs had been results in reinforcement learning and game playing. So things like AlphaGo and also StarCraft and Dota playing. So real-time games, but also these board games. And we had situations where you had these very advanced agents that could, in some sense, just blast through the human level. They were trained based on their success in these games. But the idea of trying to teach them ethics or to have them have the right values seemed almost impossible. How would you teach something that only knows the game of Go or chess? How would you teach it moral questions? It's not even clear that that it was even meaningful or possible.
Yeah.
But now we have these systems that have been trained on basically all written human knowledge. Some of them have been trained, I think, illegally on all books ever published. And so these models have read, every philosophy book and many of the academic papers and things, and can answer all kinds of questions. As Stuart Russell had pointed out, even back then, future systems may well have read all of the books. And if you think about works of fiction, almost every page involves people doing things to other people and having judgments about it as to whether it was fair or unfair.
Yeah.
And so it's got a huge amount of knowledge about that. And Now, the question is less about would these systems be able to understand what's right and wrong, or at least, plausible views on that. And it's more, would they care about it? So they might be able to answer quite detailed questions about whether people are likely to get upset if they're treated in certain ways. But it's not clear that that they are then bound by those principles themselves.
Yeah, well, I mean, in cold frankness, I'm not sure if we are, right? I mean, can we be real about that? I mean, doesn't it seem plausible that morality is sort of like the structures that we build to sort of have hopefully some degree of net benefit and bar others from doing horrendous things to us and whatever we, and in Hume's words, we call those things ill that harm us and those things virtues that help us. Might that just be the case across the board? So you're almost saying maybe they'll just see them as abstractions and not even deal with them or kind of walk right through them. It sort of feels like humans do that almost ubiquitously. We kind of have law because humans do that, right?
Yeah, well, so many humans aren't always bound by these ideas about morality, but they're less likely to make clear mistakes. For example, to just not understand that something was wrong when they're doing it. If they are attempting to do something wrong, they'll often hide the fact that they were doing so because they're aware that others will judge them badly. But we might expect AI systems to be doing things like that as well. But back then, these leading systems were agents, and they were optimizing and being trained in playing these games to play extremely well. And the part of the concern was the idea that these agents, that all they care about is winning in whatever game they've been given. Then might have no compunction about breaking other rules if they haven't been expressed to it. But then, with the rise of large language models, we had these systems that could potentially understand a lot about ethics and law, but also they weren't themselves inherently agents. So they don't, out of the box, they just respond to a question. They don't plan which response to this question would lead to a new situation in the world that I'm seeking to create. And so, therefore, the concerns that they would plan to deceive us and so on, and then reap the benefits, are not directly applicable. And to the extent to which one can turn the current systems into agents by having this scaffolding, to have them think through, what the consequences of things would be, and to get them to try to plan. To the extent to which we can do that, at the moment, they think in English in their chain of thought or some other natural language, and that's more than we really could have possibly hoped for back in 2019. That the natural thoughts these things are having could be observed by us. And then another big difference is that the training signal that we had back then was a case of you play a game of Go Out, and then you find out whether you won or lost, and then that rewards it. And so just kind of one bit of information every time you play these games. Whereas now what they've done is that they've trained, in some sense, to imitate human language creation, and trained on a huge wealth of information, about 10 trillion tokens. So that's roughly 10 trillion words of human speech. And so they've managed to get a much richer signal about all of human affairs and human behavior. And one thing that means is that these earlier arguments about how we might expect, once AI starts improving its capabilities, to just blast quickly through the human level, that there's nothing special about the human level, and we wouldn't expect it to delay very long there. Whereas now, we might expect it to actually take quite a bit longer, at least to be a kink in the curve when it reaches the human ability, since it was trained on 10 trillion words of human information.
Yeah, well, and so we could call this kind of a new variable, clearly opens up new pathways that might go forward. It sounds like you're almost saying it's also maybe this gives us a little bit more time to hang at human-ish world before, a blast off in all these various and relevant powers. I mean, I imagine there are powers we can conceive of, you and I. So, ability to write poetry in Mandarin, ability to conceive of, economic policies in certain kinds of economic zones or something like that. And then there's also probably powers that we can't conceive of. But what you're saying is that the blast through may be more bounded based on the way training is happening now?
Yeah, that you may expect, what I would expect is that there's imitation learning, imitating human behavior. So trying to work out what is the next token that a human would produce, being the pre-training that takes it there.
Yeah.
That is a case of something that in some sense would converge on the human level. That if you put in an infinite amount of compute and data, that what you'd get is something indistinguishable from human outputs. And so rather than the human level in Go just being a particular arbitrary capability level.
Yes.
Instead, this is the one that the training data is kind of pulling it towards. And you might be able to get beyond it, for example, by switching to reinforcement learning at that stage. But then you'd expect the growth in capabilities to go back to the way that reinforcement learning grows, instead of this kind of real boost that came from this imitation learning.
Yeah, I wonder if we'll ambulate between the two. I also wonder if some domains are more suited for some than others. I mean, you mentioned Go versus moral reasoning, right? I mean, this seems like a clear example for me. We can't. It's hard to score who's a winner on moral reasoning. Are you a winner in Confucian terms? Are you a winner by some Aristotelian terms? And so there's some of these domains where predicting inventory levels based on weather and the financial condition of your suppliers and XYZ and QRS, we could just see when the shipments show up and just figure out how to win at that and just do way better than what would a human, screw what a human would do, just tell me when it's accurate. But then there's other areas where it's fuzzier. And mentally, I think I'd have to sit and kind of draw the box. But how do you draw the box around that fuzzier area where it's not as objective? And so we wouldn't expect the blast through. We would expect more of a kind of a convergence on the way people do it. I mean, moral reasoning you almost brought up as your first example. How should I conceptually consider that box? How should our audience consider that box?
I think it's a really interesting question and key to future developments in AI. And also, it's very difficult. I feel that the ability to kind of with the ground truth score the result as to whether it was right or wrong. I feel that that's probably quite a narrow set of tasks that we're interested in, and it could be that if you train for ability in that set, it generalizes somewhat outside of it to things that weren't quite scoreable, but were similar in terms of the reasoning skills involved or things like that. But I think it could be a very narrow set. So I'll give you an example. When it comes to computer programming, the latest systems involving these reasoning models have been able to be, I think, competitive with the very best programmers in programming competitions. So that's where you have to program something that solves a certain problem. And then I think the question is, how efficiently does your code run? And that's exactly testable.
Yeah.
And so that's the exact scenario where you'd expect these things to do well, and they do extremely well. But if you think about coding, most programs that we use outside of a computer science class, they don't stop. They don't give you an answer and then stop. The programs run forever until you decide to quit them. They're interactive programs and they involve interfaces. So as an example, take something like Microsoft Word. It is a program where you can write things, but what's the unit test for Microsoft Word that tells you if you've written a good word processor? It's not clear how to do that. And even in the case of something like a ray tracer that takes a description of a group of objects and then it draws a picture of them, it's not clear how to score the grid of pixels because you could have a very good ray tracer that produces a somewhat different picture to someone else's. Maybe it's a better picture. And so in a lot of actual coding examples, even before you get into examples of dealing with, say, government policy or ethics or things, you get cases that are actually quite ambiguous as to how to score them. And so I think that it could be quite a narrow set that are actually clearly scoreable.
I think there's credence to that. I think that I presume at some level there may be ways of scoring and understanding things that, intelligence is vastly beyond ourselves could do. Which may be as comprehensible to us as this conversation would be to like a Labrador retriever. But yeah, at the time being, while we're building these things and we're the ones determining is there a goalpost, some of them are fuzzy as heck. What does that mean for AGI risk and governance? I mean, the people tuned in here are building this stuff or thinking about kind of the control and coordination around this stuff going in the wrong direction. Where does this paradigm and insight fit into how you hope policy thinkers and builders conceive of the technology?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that, that comes into a whole set of issues about the shift towards reasoning models. So let's look at this one first in terms of scoreability. So I think that it suggests that the landscape of tasks that are achievable by these systems is going to start to change in shape a bit. So prior to the rise of LLMs, the big successes by companies like DeepMind involved somewhat general systems for training specialist agents. So, for example, the Atari work was a system that could take an Atari game and then train an agent that was good at playing that Atari game. The agent that was trained couldn't play any other Atari games, but it was good at the one it was trained on. They'd hoped for more transfer of skills between them, but it tended not to work that well. Whereas with the rise of LLMs, we've finally had systems that are extremely general, that can play not just different Atari games, but all kinds of different games and all kinds of different speech activities that we could have. They can answer questions about policy. They could perhaps provide not stupid ideas about novel policy, drawing on classical works and drawing on kind of general ideas in policymaking or whatever the domain is for so many different domains, extremely general. But when it comes back to these reinforcement learning type techniques where you need to score it, I do think that they're very narrow. So we might expect that progress, if we have progress through reasoning models, we might expect it to help with this kind of narrow subset of these tasks that are scoreable objectively. And then maybe also to help, but to a lesser degree, with tasks that are scoreable by AI systems. So there's something that we sometimes think about as the recognition generation gap. So, for example, I can recognize good music in some sense to a much higher degree than I can create good music.
Same.
And so sometimes we have that with something like taste, where maybe you can recognize a well-designed website, but you don't know how to design one yourself. And so if you've got a lot of AI capability or a lot of compute, you can try many times and then score them. So you could try generating lots of different websites and then score the ones that seem to be doing well. And one way to think about that is suppose your perception or ability to distinguish. Let's say you've been asked to write a good poem. If your ability to distinguish good poems means that you can reliably pick ones in the top 10% of poems or something like that. Then if you could generate lots and lots of different poems, you'll basically, suppose you generated 1,000 poems. It might be a bit useless because by the time you've generated 20, you've probably got one that's in the top 10% of the ones that you'd be able to create. And then you'd be able to pick that one. But you may not have enough resolution in your taste to be able to know which of the ones which are in the top 10% are better than each other. If so, then it might not really matter how many more you generate. The real question is how precise is your taste at evaluating these examples. And so we might find that fields where AI systems can have better taste or better discriminatory capabilities in terms of understanding what's a good output are ones where that's what limits the growth. So in cases where it's objectively checkable, they could do much better because we've got perfect discriminatory ability in terms of understanding it. Whereas in more subjective areas, it may be that AI capabilities don't improve that much.
Really interesting. So I'm gonna continue drilling into what this means for the people building and the people governing this stuff. But I'm gonna kind of nutshell what you're saying and just make sure I'm following you. So, like you were talking about websites being kind of, I know it's beautiful, but I don't really. There's other ways to look at websites, like does it convert traffic? Like does traffic from this source, this source, this source, and this source turn into dollars when they land on it, or opt-ins or whatever the next action is that we need to do. In that regard, we might expect AI to be extremely nimble. I fully expect to be surfing a web that is just conjured explicitly on whatever behavior it knows for me, whatever it knows about my preferences, to be like ideally conversion conducive. But I don't expect to surf that web for long, because I expect to have an AI that surfs the web and then gives me the objective version of all of my options and then lets me choose among them. So there's some areas of this that I think will be like, yep, it's a website. Beauty ain't the thing, man. Conversion's the thing. But in some areas, like, again, poetry writing or, a good wine or something like that, like, these feel really wishy-washy. It almost, I'll tell you what comes to mind as you say this, and I'd love to know, you thought a lot more about this than I, because I'm just kind of considering all of it. It strikes me as, okay, does that mean there's credence? So with LLMs, there's been credence to this take of, you see, machines can write the poems and draw the art. They have hearts and souls too. The future will be populated with all the richness that we think humans have. And I'm not saying that's an inherently wrong position. I think it's a little bit naive, but there's some credence to it. Surely. I mean, I've read some poetry by these machines. It's pretty compelling. I've seen some artwork. It's pretty compelling. But then there's what you're saying is almost like, well, now I'm thinking, oh, geez, Toby, does this mean we kind of flutter in this human replicating space for everything that's wishy-washy? And some of that's like really what we think is valuable in life. But then like ability to convert, ability to predict, ability to like those things, and it really just does become a cold optimizer, right? Like I'm almost feeling two competing forces. How do you think about this?
Yeah, I guess I should step back and say that the lens I'm giving here, this insight about ability to discern what's good, and as a guide for generating it, I think that's a very useful lens, but it doesn't tell you everything. According to this lens, it suggests that that you'll get a world that's more algorithmically optimized for the types of metrics that we can actually measure.
Yeah.
If you don't like that about the capitalist world, if you dislike the fact that the web, in the 2020s, is much more optimized by big business for making money and a lot less experimental and so on, then you may really not like a future where that's the only thing that it can do at this extreme level. But that said, I do think that I've seen a lot of, AI-generated, inverted commas, photographs produced by Midjourney back when that was the thing everyone was posting on Twitter.
Yes.
And I'm not sure that I would call this stuff art or AI art, because I think that art is not just the artifact itself. I think it's the artifact produced with some desire to communicate something from one being to another. But
yes,
whatever it is, it's definitely a picture, and the pictures are often, I think, extremely beautiful. And so I remember wondering at the time whether we would be in a future where beauty was too cheap to meter, and just everything would end up being beautiful because it's so cheap to produce
Makes
beauty
sense.
everywhere. Maybe, all of our rooms would be filled with, beautiful pictures and so forth. That said, I guess one can already get the images quite cheaply of, say, famous works of art that are out of copyright and put them up on our walls, and we often don't bother doing that. So maybe maybe the answer is that a lot of beauty is already too cheap to meter, and it still doesn't change things.
I think there is an argument that the AR lens, like, do I want to look out my window in Weston, Massachusetts right now? It's nice. In the spring and the summer, it's reasonable. Like in the winter, it kind of sucks. But it's decent out right now. But like, maybe what I'd want to see is like a purple sky with a dragon soaring through it or something, right? Maybe that'd be nicer. And maybe if this house could be more of a castle sometimes, or more of a spaceship sometimes, or more of a whatever my predilections are that day. So I think when I hang something on a wall, I become blind to it, as we all do. But I think if we can swim in worlds that are always inching towards beauty, and maybe there's biofeedback or even preference ratings that are kind of happening on a regular basis, then there could be a way to kind of measure and calibrate to like that which seems beautiful. Of course, then my hedonic treadmill anchors at that, and then the real world completely sucks. And now it's a hardware problem, and I got to start drilling into the skull, and then we run into all kinds of other stuff. But I will say, I think there is credence to the beauty too cheap to meter if it be conjured all the time. Is that almost a way, or let's just throw that on the table, and as we unpack this idea that you've been kind of rolling about. Let's say we take something like, well, I don't know, beauty's pretty tough, man. It's pretty tough. Like, well, if I have AR contact lenses and I have some kind of biofeedback on everything from the sweat on my hands to the pulse of my skin to whatever, and then I'm occasionally asked in natural language for my response for certain things, and my mood is being scored in a pretty damn reliable way across, multiple data streams, and sort of to the point where the system will know what is the most beautiful landscape I could see out this window better than I could. It'll know what the most insightful or inspiring, historical quote would be. It might even make one up that's even more inspiring than what Plutarch actually said, or what Emerson actually said, or whatever. It almost seems like there could be a degree of hyper-calibration to the individual, maybe even scaled across populations, where it's like, well, this is the classical can't measure it stuff, but like, with enough ways to measure it, we got better, and now we can optimize for it. I wonder, are there going to be ways to break through some of the veil of subjectivity in that regard, or are those dark paths? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess it's interesting. Maybe what's going on here with this beauty case, that was a bit of a paradox for us, because we were at one level suggesting it's the type of thing that would be difficult, and another level, maybe we're already seeing it. Yeah. Maybe the answer there is that these systems, the generative picture systems, are a form of imitation learning. So there was a lot of discussion about these Studio Ghibli-like images being created recently. I actually avoided seeing those and making them because I hold the films of Studio Ghibli very dear in my heart, and I don't want it to be devalued. I know that it would be as soon as I see 1,000 of these images. But also it would be devalued in some sense, but it's not at all clear that, in fact, it's almost certain that these AI systems could not produce Studio Ghibli-style images if Studio Ghibli had never existed.
Of course.
It's learnt a style, so it's learnt from a lot of examples of a style to generalize somewhat beyond them to a wider part of a style. And so it's one of these cases of imitation learning, which are the types of areas where you don't expect it to blast beyond human level ability, but it can quickly reach human level ability. Whereas if it has to get somewhere via reinforcement learning, and we're wondering whether it could blast past the human level, they're the situations where I think that subjective things will hold it back.
Okay, and so I'll use this as kind of a catalyst to move us into the other questions around governance. Obviously, governance kind of being the main song and dance here for this episode, but I think it's cool to kind of unpack what has fundamentally shifted and what new things are you thinking about, because all of these get taken into account to how the heck we manage these transitions. So I like that we have this on the table. If you could nutshell, as we get into the other questions here, if you could nutshell sort of, hey, Dan, look, for the people trying to figure out how to govern this stuff, they're thinking about the data of children, or they're thinking about rogue AGI risk, or they're thinking about AI replacing spouses and friendship, whatever regulatory governance coordinated people would kind of think about. Where do you hope they store this mentally? How should this update maybe what issues they think about in what way? Is there anything tangible you would want them to walk away with?
From the particular
the specific
thing
idea around reasoning that you just mentioned about imitation.
Yeah. I guess, one thing is if you're trying to understand, it's important for us to understand what are the timelines here towards much more advanced capabilities. Ultimately, governance takes time, and we generally have this pacing problem with technology governance, where technologies move quite quickly, whereas governance moves quite slowly. Oh, yeah. And so it can always be kind of, behind and unable to actually govern the leading edge of things. And so it is useful to understand how quickly things are changing and where they might go. And what I'm suggesting is that one should expect things to change. The things that should be changing the fastest and perhaps going beyond the human level by the largest amounts are the ones that are easily measurable.
Yeah.
At the moment, when it comes to the benchmarks for these reasoning models that have been extremely impressive, those really impressive things are often things like coding problems, where they're the type of coding problems where they're easily measurable. And so one should expect that that's seeing the leading edge of acceleration, and that there will be other things that will accelerate much less than those.
Yeah, I begrudge just how many attractor states there are to conjuring agency and volition. There's so many arguments like, well, it's not an animal, it's just a toaster oven. You tell it what to do, and it's like I'm hearing what you're saying, and I'm like, ooh, there are just so many economic motives to ask it. So the coding problem you just talked about, how much money and power is at stake to be able to conceive of something that could conceive of the ways of measuring those things that aren't yet measurable in the context of the broader business or economic objectives of the overall organization, to somehow drink in the totality of that context and be able to judge and pull from all of that? Is someone not already working on that? I would be shocked to the marrow of my bones if people weren't spending millions and millions already on exactly that problem. And so, where does that take us?
You're right that there's a big incentive towards it. I'm actually not so sure that there's all that much going on there yet. I think that once it becomes a pain point, and that reasoning models have accelerated the other things much more, and these are holding things back, then there'll be more market pressure. But I agree that it will become. It can take some foresight to see these issues now, but they'll become obvious to everyone, in 6 months' time or so. However, I think this is an issue that humanity's been dealing with for quite a long time. So the question of how to have appropriate targets or measures in order to be able to turn into the world of quantitative analysis things that were harder to quantify about, say, running a hospital system or running a website and so on, or a social media algorithm to recommend good posts to people. One thing to remember here is that for quite some time, people have already been trying to measure the unmeasurable. Governments have been trying to work out how to put targets on many of the things that they do in order to measure them and to incentivize people to produce more of those things. So, for example, they work out that maybe when it comes to healthcare, that questions about how long people are waiting in emergency rooms or what fraction of surgeries are successful and things like this can be measured. Also, the private sector has been trying to create these types of measurements as well. So, for example, maybe different website designs in some sense can be measured by these attempts to work out click-through rates and various things like that. Or, do people immediately leave the website if we change the background color to a certain color or not, in order to work out what's less intimidating or something. And so we've had a bunch of that process already, and the track record of it is not great.
It's absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. And so, you can often tell, if you're aware of this process, you can kind of tell in some cases whether things have been optimized via that rather than optimized by finding an employee with taste who has made some decisions themselves. So therefore, I think it's a difficult problem. However, maybe trying to get the AIs to have better taste and better powers to discern these things would be more productive line.
All right. And I know we've got a bunch to get into for governance, but I've read some of your work recently on kind of the shift towards inference training as opposed to kind of the previous sort of pre-training methods. This is going to have some spillover in terms of how we think about governance. So lay on us what for you has fundamentally shifted. Maybe explain the concept that you're conceiving of and then where its importance is for governance. I'd love to break this down.
Yeah. So here's how I'm seeing the biggest effect of this. Ultimately, a lot of the growth in capabilities of AI systems over the last 5 years has been through this scaling up of pre-training compute and data. So this is the process where the AI systems are doing next token prediction on a very large corpus of text. And that seems to be running into some issues. There were some leaks late last year from I think all the leading AI labs, with the people expressing some concern about the next 10 times bigger models and whether they were really getting all that much for what they were putting in. And it seems to be that's being caused by running out of high quality data. Ultimately, if the AI systems have read all of the books that have ever been written, then the fact that there's about 10 times as many words in Reddit comments that haven't been trained on yet, while there's a lot of words, but is it going to provide a large amount of insight compared to the last 10,000 years of written language by humans? My guess is not. It's a high bar, really. And so I think that there is some concern that the benefits we're getting for this scaling of pre-training, so learning based on all of the text, that's kind of running out of steam a bit. Not that it necessarily will flatline, but that we're getting less from it. And I think that panned out with the release of GPT 4.5, which I think was a bit underwhelming. Certainly, even OpenAI didn't make a very big deal of it when it was released. In contrast, there's been the switch to this sometimes called inference scaling or reasoning models, where what they do is they learn to create these very long chains of thought, so to think about the problem for a long time and do some hidden working, and then just to show you the finished product. So whereas the pre-trained model like GPT 4.0, if you get it to write you an essay, it has to just come up with the essay off the top of its head. Every sentence is just what immediately occurs to it with minimal planning. Whereas if you used an inference-based system, it could do a lot of internal scratchpad work and kind of many different drafts of it, perhaps thousands of different drafts of it in some cases, before producing the final answer. So we saw OpenAI do that when they tried to solve this ARC AGI benchmark with their O3 model. And they did 1,024 different attempts, each of which wrote about 50 pages of work for a total number of words equal to that of the Encyclopedia Britannica to solve a simple pixel grid type task that my 10-year-old child can solve reliably. But it produced, this Encyclopedia Britannica level of text in order to try to solve it. So that shows you that what they're trying to do here, instead of scaling up the training, which is a bit like sending someone to school, then to high school, then to university, maybe postgraduate education, and then you can, once you've put in all of that effort to train someone up, maybe a new employee at your firm, you can then, have someone who their first response to a lot of different areas is very informed by all of this background information and learning that they've done. Whereas the idea with inference scaling is it's more like giving the person longer to answer the question. So maybe we pause the education at the undergraduate level, but instead of just giving them 10 minutes to answer the customer's query or what the boss has asked them to produce, we give them 10 hours to think about it. And so the upside is that the previous system was very good for improving the kind of system one type intuitive responses, the very first thing you'll say when you're asked the question. But this reasoning approach is good at doing the system two type things. At least they're the terms in human psychology, where it involves explicit reasoning about the task. So that's good that we can also do that. But the real downside of it is that if that's where you try to get your capabilities from, is that you have to pay those extra costs at deployment every single time you deploy it. So instead of the kind of business model that we're used to, where there's a very large upfront cost of developing the model, and then deployment in each case is quite cheap.
Just use the weights that are already in
we've
there.
got a situation where if you, as they're trying, if you 100x the inference time compute, so you make it kind of think for 100 times as long as its final answer internally before producing the final answer. Maybe it tries 20 different times in parallel, each of which is 5 times longer, and then chooses the best one or something. If you do something like that, you're paying that 100 times as much every single time someone wants to use it. And those costs are really large. And that's why we've seen this change from AI systems basically costing less than $1 a day the $20 a month kind of subscription model, such that, everyone at least in America or the UK really could afford to have access to the leading edge AI systems of the world for less than $1 a day. Now we've got these systems being offered for $10 a day, and I think that these prices, if they haven't already gone up beyond that, will indeed do so. So that's where the difference is coming from, is the fact that you have to, every time you use it, have to pay the scale up amount.
Yeah.
And then that has a whole lot of different consequences for AI governance.
Cool. Touch on the few that for you matter most, and then we'll fly into kind of some of the meat and potatoes around governance. But I think this paradigm clearly makes sense, and it strikes me that, maybe back in the day, which is in AI back in the day is like last Wednesday. So like last Wednesday, everybody could just click the button twice for their $20 a month thing, and they would get as good of an answer as Musk would get for whatever, banana bread recipes to business plans, doesn't matter. Now, if I'm an individual or a corporation and I want a much better business plan, or I want much better code being written, or I want a much better schema to help me architect this new, hospital building I'm building or whatever, I may be able to just have this thing really sit and crank it out, and maybe even use more resources to pull from all the best practices of architecture from known thinkers that I respect, and loop that into sort of like what they take into account and whatever the case may be. And each of those little dialogue points with that system, it's doing so much work in the background that if I have more dollars to spend, I can spin way more cycles and just get way, way more done. So it makes it less of an equaling of the playing field and more of like, how much compute do you have equals how powerful you are in the world, kind of period. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. So here are a few quick fire ones. So one of them is that, you get people like Dario Amodei has said, he's had this idea of, I think, 1 million geniuses in a data center, at some point, I guess it was
a country of geniuses in a data. Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah.
This is his phrase. And you can think of that, that's his attempt to work out, once you reach the point where you've had a system large enough to train your model that reaches kind of beyond human level abilities, at the point where you've done that, and then you switch that system over from doing the training to doing the inference, so serving that model to people, his estimate was that it would be able to provide the equivalent of 1 million different simultaneous people. So if you switch all of that server farm over to inference. But if the way that you've got there is from this scaling up of inference, so scaling up the amount of compute done at deployment time, every time you scale that up by a factor of 10, the number of geniuses in your data center is going down by a factor of 10. So if you get there by scaling things up by a factor of 1,000, in terms of, and we've already seen attempts to scale up by those types of factors, then maybe we're talking 1,000 geniuses in a data center. Or if we get there by scaling up by a factor of 1 million, so we get 6 orders of magnitude of this inference scaling, which we probably will have, within a couple of years, at least in some examples. Maybe it's just 1 genius in a data center where the entire thing is turned over, this entire training compute is turned over to running it. If you keep, spending more and more for every one that you serve, then this is the kind of thing that happens. So that could really change how sharp the moment of reaching human level is. Because will it be the case that we're effectively, as Dario Amodei suggests, a whole extra country of geniuses is brought online in the world? Or will it be instead that more like a company of geniuses is brought online at that moment? And a related idea is the question of what is the price of the first human level AI system? If the price of it is below human wages, it could have this massive impact. But if the price of it is above human wages, it's not clear that it will have all that much impact directly at all. And we may then just have to wait for that price to fall until it falls below the wages for a particular field. And if with inference scaling, every time you scale up this inference by an order of magnitude, you increase the price of the model by a factor of 10. And so it increases the chance that at the moment of reaching these types of models, that they don't have immediate massive impact in the labor market. because they turn out to cost 100 times as much as human labor or something like that. In which case, they could be very useful for, say, demonstrations. For example, you could imagine a demonstration in front of the General Assembly at the UN showing a human-level agent conversing and answering everyone's questions. It would be worth paying 100 times the wages of a person for a day to make that demonstration. But it would, in some sense, mean that we have a forewarning that this thing will probably become cheap enough to hit everything. But at least we could, at great expense, have examples of such agents and understand them and demo them.
Yeah. So what dawned on me when you were like, well, and if it may be much more expensive than people or what have you, sort of the obvious immediate thought is like, how long do I have? Like, can I hold my breath until it's not? Because I probably could. I could probably, if I really, it's not going to be fun, but like my face would be a little bit purple, but then I'd be like, it's cheaper than people now. And because like I'm looking at how much money's going into data centers right now. I'm looking at how many shovels are going to go on the ground just to house exactly the resources to do exactly this. How much big tech is talking about like nuclear plants. Those aren't going to come online next week, but like, were they talking about nuclear plants 5 years ago? Obviously they weren't. Right? We all know they weren't. So the amount of power that's in demand and probably swiftly coming online, the amount of compute in demand swiftly coming online, the amount of efforts to repurpose CPUs to do GPU-like things. So even if we can't make them fast enough, we can still do AI-like stuff on existing hardware. All of these forces big tech is already wrestling with. And is already like finding every possible way to like crack through, like fundamental software, fundamental hardware breakthroughs, repurposing of certain kinds of hardware, all of this stuff like this. The financial singularity will preclude or will precede the technological one. All the dollars are getting poured into this right now. It just is what it is. So it seems to me like, God, I don't know how long we have when it's actually more expensive than people. But I guess what you're saying is, maybe it actually is a substantial enough amount of time where it could induce maybe not the Toby Ord ideal long reflection, but it could induce a Toby Ord short reflection where people would be able to be like, oh, it's that powerful. Well, now maybe I'll think about it. Is this what you're getting at?
Yeah, I would say that's the main thing, is that it smooths the transition. It's less like there's just one day the new model finishes training and then bang, it's doing 1/10 of the price of human wages. For $2 an hour, it's replacing all of our jobs.
Every job in the world,
as opposed to it's $20,000 an hour, but every year it's halving in price or something, and we can kind of see it coming, and that would make policymakers be able to plan much more about when this is going to hit. But also, I think sometimes people in the area are a bit glib about all of these orders of magnitude. So they keep racking up 10xing the cost, 10xing the energy use of these systems and so on. And they seem to imagine there's an unlimited amount of times that you can put in 10 times the inputs. Whereas what we're actually doing is we've found an efficient kind of set of ideas that are economically important and perhaps important to the whole future of humanity. And we're scaling them up towards the largest kind of level that people are willing to pay for or that governments are willing to put into or something. And we might hit those limits in terms of with a few more tenfold increases. And then also in terms of the efficiencies that we're hoping for, I don't think that there is, say, a billion-fold efficiencies just lying around, which would be 9 orders of magnitude. I think there's probably less than that. And so if we just say, oh, it's quite inefficient, but we'll just get another 3 orders of magnitude of efficiency somehow from these engineers who are optimizing things, many things have reached the point where there's only 10% of efficiencies that are remaining. And at some point that will happen here. And so it could be that these things actually stall out at a level where they're more expensive than human wages, and it's actually very slow, the improvements. I actually don't think that's that likely, but I do think people can get a little bit glib with quite how easy it is to make a product 1,000 times cheaper than it was yesterday.
Totally. I mean, I wouldn't say it's trivial. I guess I would just say it seems to me that we have fundamental breakthroughs in hardware and software. We have, like, again, repurposing of this stuff.
Yeah.
We have entire, like every third company that's going to be founded is going to be working. So there's going to be one giant river of money, like the Great Nile, the final human river of money will just be this. It just is what it is. I don't make the rules. I think that's going to be how it is. So there's a final river of money, and the animals live off the river of money. You have to live near water. So the companies that get started are all going to be working on this. I think as the financial singularity becomes more and more clear, the innovation speeds, I suspect, will be more and more clear. That doesn't mean I think nuclear plants are going to come online like that, but it does mean I think there will be modes of efficiency, like ways of doing computer vision that you and I could not conceive of. In fact, nobody's thought of yet, that will be like transcendently more efficient in some weird permutation of breakthrough. And that those will not be unique to one pocket or another. Now, that said, I'm not arguing against your general point, which is, hey, Dan, I think actually the kickoff shockwave of Intellitronium eating the earth just doesn't feel like it's going to be a tomorrow thing. I would say, yes, I'm totally seeing the credence of what you're getting at. And it almost feels like, part of me is like, man, I'm scratching my chin. Toby seems to be more chill about things 6 years after his book or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, am I reading you right? It's almost like, hey, Dan, I kind of think we might have time to think about this now. Like, this is kind of cool. Like, am I reading you correctly?
You're kind of right there. And I think that a lot of the technical changes since I wrote my book have been good news in regards to this key risk that I focused on when it comes to AI risk, which was this risk of sometimes called AI takeover or loss of control scenarios, where you have an AI agent that's substantially smarter than a human, but that is fundamentally not fully aligned with humanity. That type of scenario, I think that the technological things that have happened have made that less scary than it was 5 years ago, which is great news. However, I'm also somewhat increasingly worried about some other types of scenarios.
Give us. I hope we can spill a couple minutes because I don't want to miss these. I don't want to miss these, Toby. This sounds good. You're teasing me too much now. So the kind of top two bullets of the newer risks. So there's some, to your point, that feel like, okay, that's just less likely given the factors at play. But there's others where you're like, oof, that's new, and that might be more likely. What are some of those? Because obviously governance people are going to want to know.
So, I mean, I think you'll find a lot of them familiar. So one of them is this risk of, let's say, weapons of mass destruction becoming more accessible because AI systems can uplift people's skills to the level where they could produce them. So the example that's most often talked about is with biorisk. Is it possible to create a virus that would kill everyone? Such that if a person like say the cultists from Aum Shinrikyo, if they had access to such a system, they would have tried to produce a virus like this. So that's one type, where that's a case where, where maybe centralization is a bit of an answer to it, or there's this question of how should you avoid this falling into the wrong hands, where open source models may be a problem because it's easier to take, or open weight models, because it's easier to take the safeguards off by fine-tuning those weights. But some of these other challenges are things where decentralization or multipolarity actually could help. So an example is risk of human takeover. So if an AI system is smart enough that it could, let's say, make a lot of copies of itself and do various things in order to lead to it taking over, then it's also capable enough that even if it was aligned to the intent of its user, that a human could command it to do that in order to to redound to that human's benefit. That they could get this system to effectively take over the world for the human user. That human user could be the leader of an AI company or the leader of a country that develops an AI program. And that concerns me greatly, more so than it did in the past. And that's something where decentralization or kind of concentration of power seems to be a big part of the problem. And so deconcentrating the power would be part of a solution. So I think that for many of these big themes in AI governance, they help with some of these landscape of risks, but they may hurt with other ones. And it's difficult to know how to navigate that. I don't think there are easy solutions.
Yeah, I certainly don't expect there are. I mean, it sort of feels like almost some of the history of humanity, and we might argue, of progress in civilization, has been the balancing of those two things, right? Like, we can either all live on our own little subsistence farm, or we can have a king. That sucks. Like, is there a middle thing? We could have a group of people, but then the group of people could just be like a king kind of thing. That kind of, and then so we've developed, Venice had a way of squaring this. So they actually did like super well. Of course, the founding fathers here in America read them, and they read the Greeks, and they read whatever. And you guys had some means of pulling this stuff off a little bit before we did. And so we've kind of done this not too centralized thing, right? Like if we use Spinoza terms, like what's the right amount of potestas to bound the kind of power and potentia that could shred apart the progress and the value that we've created. So what's the means and mode of it? What new form of it must exist? And as humans, we've done this many times. The UN is kind of a weird thing. Like it's kind of like a globe. Like what's up with that? In 1500, that was not going to be an idea. No one was bandying about in a serious manner the idea of a United Nations. So it feels like what you're saying is, hey, some of these risks will be reduced by centralization. Some of these risks might be heightened thereby, such as obviously some of these challenges are new, but that core challenge of that tug of war feels to me like governance and humanity writ large.
And I think that many ideas from political theory, which I know very little of actually, but ideas to do with, say, concentration of power, are going to be very helpful for guiding our way through this. And I think that there's going to be a lot of opportunities to draw on people with skills in those areas to try to understand it. And then a final one of these scenarios that I'm concerned about is a bit different, which is that this idea that is sometimes called gradual disempowerment.
We had David on. Great. I love the idea. What are you most concerned about? So our listeners will be familiar with the paradigm of sort of AI gradually, again, being better at us than everything, and we have less and less to do and whatever. What are you most concerned about there?
Yes, this is a case where I'm most concerned about a version where we grant the AI rights to control the fruits of its labor in some way. And then if AI is smarter than us, I could imagine a scenario where perhaps due to trade, we're still increasing our income in absolute terms, but AIs are increasing their income faster than us, and such that the share of wealth and ultimately the share of power in the world gradually moves further and further into the hands of AI agents. And they may not be concentrated. It may not just be a single agent or a single type of agent. It could be that they're very heterogeneous and created by many different companies in different countries. But still, it could be that humanity kind of gets squeezed. And if you imagine a situation where, 100 years into the future, we only control 1% of the assets and have very little of the power that influences governments in terms of making decisions. Maybe that's all she wrote for us, and we're ultimately at the mercy of these systems. Yeah. So that kind of scenario could happen even if they respect rights. So it doesn't have to involve AIs using lethal means against us or anything like that. We could end up in that situation even if all property rights and things are respected. Ultimately, with the current political economic system, people have the right to compete with each other to win jobs that you and I, only one of us could get the job. Yes. And it's not considered a problem if someone outcompetes someone for a job or outcompetes them in the market, even if it drives the other person into bankruptcy. And ultimately, AI systems could be outcompeting us in these ways, systematically leading humans to have bad outcomes, even though they're not breaking any rules or violating any rights.
I mean, it seems... And those are toughy situations, because then it's like, does it also have the moral traits that make us valuable? Should we stop it? You know what I mean? It's like these get real sticky. It hasn't been
trained to have them, right? It's been trained to have the intellectual traits that make us valuable. Totally. It's not clear whether or not it would end up with the moral traits.
Yeah, absolutely not clear. I think that's the only. So I've had many people on the show with certainty about their theory of consciousness. Oh, it is already conscious. Oh, it would be if you built it by my, of course, I'm very well decorated. So if you built it the way that I articulate, it would be for granted we could take that it would be conscious. Others just say, of course, it never could be. I consider all of these to be disingenuous. I think the only position is we almost don't know what intelligence even is, never mind sentience. And that it would be bonkers to let the runaway train run wild if we know not if it be carrying the flame of what value actually is beyond us. If it just be optimizing for goofball stuff and squashing Earth life, what a horrible, what's the Bostrom Disneyland with no children situation, right? So for you, we're going to go through these questions kind of quickly, but we've gotten a heck of a lot of your background unpacking, which has been fun. I didn't want to stop you. I was like, all right, let's keep doing it. Let's keep doing it. So now I've got a lot of new ideas to bandy about, and I'm almost feeling like, all right, Toby took me on a journey here. I felt a little bit more comfortable with like some things not being urgent. And then there's some brand new challengers that have entered the ring that like we're going to have to contest with. When you think about like the importance for some degree of global coordination, you've talked about kind of like a polycentric system in the past of different sort of nation states, NGOs, whatever. On like a 1 to 10 scale of like, Dan, it's May 16, 2025. This is how important I think it would be as of today. Where do you stand there and why? Just kind of quick version.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely very important, and that we need to be moving towards it, or at least I think we should be. I ultimately think that that the risk from racing is very severe, and I'm very concerned about the idea of a race between, say, the US and China.
Yes,
and I'd also be very concerned about either of those countries going it alone and attempting to achieve unrivaled supremacy in this area. And so I think that if it ultimately ends up controlled at the nation state level, which I think it may well, especially if it potentially threatens life and limb of people all over the world, that's the type of thing we don't normally let companies control.
Definitely.
Then I think that a coalition of countries is really the way to do it. So I would be in favor of a, let's say, an open and growing coalition where a group of countries get together. Perhaps the CERN for AI can mean a lot of different things to different people, but you could see this within that framework, that they come together to have a seat at the table. You have to kind of make your own contribution, and also you have to agree to not have your own national program that you're working on behind the scenes. And then you get a seat at the table in terms of governance of that project and determining ultimately it's how it's going to be used.
I do want to unpack that. Before we get into the specifics of maybe what the structure of government could look like or how it might be catalyzed, which we're definitely going to unpack with you today, I kind of want to talk about for you, like, well, when you said it's very important, I'm going to say Toby's in the 8 or 9 range. I don't know. That's what I interpreted.
That sounds about
there
right.
There we go. Okay. I don't want to put words in your mouth. I was like, all right, well, that's what I estimate. Okay, good. Next point.
I think we need to be moving directly towards that now.
Already,
but it's not the case that we have to have already set it up yesterday.
Totally.
Which
I
would
think,
be a
okay,
10
important distinction. Great. I like it. Very, very crisp terms, much better than a simple number. I appreciate the richness you've added to our simple childlike scoring system. The next question is really around kind of like the purpose of this governance. So we're about to talk about the structure. The purpose, there's some things that seem obvious, like, Dan, I just laid out some risks of bioweapons and tyrannical takeover and gradual disempowerment. Part of the purpose is making sure those things don't happen. Great. And obviously, when you said the race dynamic is dangerous, clearly when you're just racing with no rules, zero potestas, you're not optimizing for like goods. You're just optimizing for winning. And of course, we have all the tragedy of the commons type stuff, right? I use a lot of analogies here, but it's like back in the day before we had an FDA, and I'm not saying I think the FDA is great or anything. Like, I think it probably has a lot of problems. But there was a time in America where if you needed to make your milk cheaper, you would just put like glue and water in it and mix it up and then like send it out. And like that would make and if you didn't, everybody else was. So like, what are you going to do? You're going to put glue in your milk is what you're going to do, or flour, whatever you can do to buffer your inventory. And then at some point it was like, yeah, we're not going to, everybody have drinking glue is probably not good. And so, potestas emergeth. And, and we came up with some rules. Clearly, so optimizing for people's health or optimizing for people getting what they think they're buying for is not automatic in the state of nature, not by a long shot. Same thing here. This positive outcomes for humans. maintaining the sanctity of humans and or even building morally relevant traits within substrates that are not human. None of those things will happen by brute military and economic conflict. So for you, when you say the purpose, Dan, for me, the crystalline purpose of having this international coordination, which of course is a big deal, an unprecedentedly big deal, your prime validation for that, what would be the reason behind it? Then we'll talk structure.
Yeah, no, basically you already guessed it. I think that the reason would be that there is a serious possibility, let's say more than 10%, of unrecoverable failures for humanity, which I call existential risks, from the creation of the first, let's say, superintelligent system, where superintelligent could be just that it creates a whole lot of human-level intelligences, but it creates 10 times as many as there are humans on Earth. And, a trillion, or let's say, of those intelligences, if there's 100 of them for every one of us, then what happens may well be determined by them, not by us. And so if we've messed anything up in the creation of that system, that could be the end. So that could happen in many different ways, as I just outlined. And so I think that the idea that one nation kind of runs ahead with that, even if they weren't in a race, if they just unilaterally were doing it, where everyone else and all other nations of the Earth are clearly stakeholders of this question, as are all future generations, that it would be illegitimate and ultimately unbearable for the other countries to have just their entire fates in the hands of another country that's not being governed at all, by this majority of people.
Yeah, I think it's a square argument. It's there's a tremendous amount of credence. I've heard ideas that maybe getting the U.S. and China together, one of the ways, like to do some kind of early CERN stuff. Of course, we need the players that are most likely to birth the sand god to really be in the mix. But there may be a way to take tech savvy but not in the runnings countries to like drum up the pressure on the big guys. Like, you two need to get along, because if you fight, we're all going to die. Like, I think I've heard arguments for that in terms of what could catalyze the kind of agreements that you're addressing. But the purpose is rather clear. I mean, in your book, and just to pulse check on this, we had like Martin Rees is obviously famously concerned with existential risk and has been for a very, very long time. Martin Rees is also of the opinion that if it were the case, and if we could be smart enough to ensure that these systems could be self-generating and also be richly sentient in the ways that we consider human life to be valuable, then we shouldn't just wish to buffer humans away, but we should also say that could carry the flame of this flickering flame of non-dead stuff. It could make sure that flickering flame existeth beyond this planet and beyond places where opposable thumbs are sort of could reasonably be expected to survive. And so for him, there could be when you talk about long-termism, of course, people associate you with that in some regards. Some purpose of coordination I've heard bandied about would be like, if this stuff is eventually rather powerful, can we calibrate and get some understanding on ensuring that if it carry on beyond us, that there could be grand moral outcomes, which potentially could even be beyond that of current living humans or even future generation of living humans, could be a stepwise change as we are above the sea snail, for example. Would you say, Dan, look, I don't like talking about that stuff right now because the risk is way too salient? Or would you say, yeah, I think that's a reasonable concern. We should bring it up after we get everybody together about the survival threat? Like, where does that stuff stand for you these days?
Yeah, so I think that Martin may well be right about that. It could well be that in the same way as our earlier hominid ancestors, or maybe even our earlier mammal ancestors, right?
Absolutely.
At the time where the dinosaurs were destroyed.
Early rodentia. Yeah.
Our ancestors were like small rodents, and they weren't the be-all and end-all, and ultimately they kind of passed on the flame to us, and we may end up, the most important role that we have may be creating our successors, as is the most important role, perhaps for many of us, we feel that
that's right.
Creating our children and having them go on to do great things, perhaps is the most important part that we played. This may be true for our species as well. But if so, the idea that we just handed the flame over to the very first system that we can create seems a bit crazy. If we take seriously the idea that this handing over is the most important thing humanity ever does, and the 10,000 years of civilization that led to this moment is just a kind of prelude to this moment, surely we really want to think it through. So the more that one puts pressure on this idea that could be really good, the more it also suggests that this is a time for kind of, taking great care.
I completely concur. I think, in my opinion, if you can conceive of a worthy successor, you should be able to conceive of many unworthy ones. And if you cannot measure that which you consider worthy, such as consciousness, such as whatever other moral traits, some people say love, some people say consciousness, some people say, creative ability. I would say autopoiesis, the ability to expand potentia as the sea snail did on its way up to us. Whatever those things are, if you don't really know at all if any of these systems have a single one of those traits, how could you ever expect an arms race to blossom into something good? Automatically. It just seems ridiculous. So I'm completely concurring with you here. I guess we can sort of wrap on closing note on what you hope. Maybe we'll go first with the builders. There's the Anthropics and whatnot. They're all in an arms race. If you're Dario or you're, Musk knows damn well the risk is higher, at least 1 in 5. Musk knows it's 90, right? Musk knows you're getting shredded by this thing. But here's, and Musk has been beating the drum against this for a long time, but here's the ball game. If you're of a certain caliber of billionaire with a certain amount of resources, you either birth the sand god and potentially ride it for a matter of seconds or months as the most important entity that ever lived on Earth, and then you get eaten by that sand god. Or you watch someone else have the final triumph, the final human triumph, and then you're eaten by their sand god. Those are your two choices in the state of nature. So Musk knowing the risks, plowing. Dario knowing the risks, plowing. Demis knowing the risks, plowing. And so that's where we are. For the innovators, what do you hope they do? Not only the founders, but maybe the people working within there, knowing they're trapped in that for right now. What could they do if they wanted this to go well?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess I would say I slightly reject some of your premise. I do think
go ahead, please, go ahead.
Some of these lab leaders are quite earnestly trying to do the right thing, and also that they intend, although intentions, don't always happen, but that they intend to produce technologies that get governed by some appropriate system beyond them. And that they hope that one can resolve some of these problems. So I think it's more that they think there's a chance that they get eaten by this thing and that everyone gets eaten by it. I am worried that a lot of the people working in these groups feel that, let's say that the chance that if their rivals get there first, maybe they think that there's a 20% chance that everyone is destroyed. Whereas if they get there first, maybe there's only an 18% chance that we all get destroyed. So they think that
bias,
instead of thinking that they're a company that has an 18% chance of destroying humanity, they think of themselves as a company that's really like a minus 2% chance because it's trying to lower the chance.
But who wouldn't have that opinion? Is anyone a villain in their own mind, right? I think that is the kind of line that is motivating a lot of people, is thinking, but really it's kind of more like, actually, it's a good thing. And I think it's worth calling out that argument. I don't think it's a good one. I'm open to it. I happen to see self-interest as the ball game, and their two options seem pretty square to me. If Dario really was and by the way, I don't demonize any of them. I'm remarkably clear. I consider incentives to be amoral. Completely amoral. I'm not asking you to agree with that. I'm just telling you how I think. So I think incentives are completely amoral. It's very hard for me to judge an organism or organization that does what is in its long-term best interest to the best of its conception. It's remarkably hard for me to judge that. So, so I don't see this as evil activity, but I really do think, I think if Dario really, I think as much as he might care about risk, he knows that if he steps to the side and starts kind of just making political noise, number one, there's way too many people that put money into him wanting to be part of the sand god. They're not going to let him step out like that. But if he did, he knows he's just going to get eaten by Altman's thing, unless somebody else builds it faster. So I do think there's some of those tensions. But it sounds like for you, it's like, Dan, I think it's mostly driven by noble souls who want to save everybody. Are you somewhere in the middle ground between those two? Or
I think it's at least a substantial aspect of it. And in fact, I think, everyone that you mentioned, I think, is at least by some substantial part driven by noble goals. I think that if you do end up in a situation where you become extremely powerful by creating the most powerful technology we've ever created, that there's this kind of absolute power corrupts absolutely idea that it's going to be very difficult to hold on to those noble goals. And I think that also this very competitive landscape at the moment is also something where the noble goals are one of the things that gets eroded by the competition.
Absolutely. And so how do we deal with that?
But it is important to notice that those things are part of it and did exist and so on, because I don't think it's possible to explain all of their actions without actually some kind of love of humanity and so forth. But one shouldn't be therefore just hand over trust to these people either.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, I'm with you. I think that we do have different philosophy of kind of the core drivers of human behavior, what have you. But your conclusion there is very reasonable. You're basically saying, look, there's some good in the mix. And by the way, I wasn't calling it bad. So I think when you heard me talk, you were like, he's demonizing Altman. No. I have an article called Altman is Every Man, where it's just talk about incentives. But basically, like, you're saying, hey, there's some good in the mix. There's some tough things that are forcing people there. I think there are some intentions that are probably good. I would concede that as well, even among the founders and the workers. But knowing they're trapped in the system where the race is a really tough game, what would you advocate they do, both the leaders and the people writing the code?
So I'd mentioned a lot of things that have gotten quite a few things that have gotten better since I wrote The Precipice. One of the things that's gotten a lot worse is this race and these pressures. The fact that back then there was a race between two AI labs, DeepMind and OpenAI, that were mainly a kind of research culture. And then subsequent to that, we got brought in multiple trillion-dollar companies became part of the race, with Google kind of really stepping in, and Microsoft, and then and more of these powers. So the race has deepened a lot and become much more commercial and much more kind of financial, and much smaller fraction of it is the noble ideas. But in terms of what should other people do, I certainly don't know exactly. But one of the things that I think is intriguing is if you think about the atomic scientists, who worked on the Manhattan Project, and without whose work, the nuclear weapons wouldn't have been created. They kind of handed over their power ultimately to the government. They were in an extreme time and so on, and they thought at the start that it was a noble purpose to try to get atomic weapons before Hitler did. Although by the end of it, Hitler was already dead when they actually dropped the first atomic weapon. So that rationale, they didn't seem to quite notice, had completely disappeared, and there was a different rationale that was leading things. But after the war, they formed together into their Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists and were actually a leading kind of voice for, as a collection of people in atomic science across, the US and also to the Soviet Union. Lots of conversations leading to lots of track 2 diplomacy and bilateral ideas about how to avoid the risk of nuclear war. If they'd managed to do that sooner, it could have been a lot better. And I think that the AI scientists who are essential for these processes to happen, individually, they don't have that much power, but collectively, they would have a substantial amount of power as like a key constituency. And I don't think that they think of themselves quite this way as this constituency, but it's possible that they could. For example, there are professional associations that they're probably all members of, such as the AAAI, and it might be possible for them to actually to sign up to a set of principles that we will not build AI systems that do X, Y, and Z. And we know that our counterparts in the other AI lab also won't build systems or won't work on systems that have these properties. And that might be a way that they could actually collectively exert substantial power.
So I'll nutshell to make sure I'm not losing you, and we'll close just very last note on what you hope the regulators do. But this is a great sort of general idea. And I like the analogy with the World War II shebang as well. Very apt. So we take people that are sort of high up in engineering or working within these organizations who recognize the race they're in, who recognize the gigantic importance of what's going on here, and who say, we should be coming together and sort of, maybe it's like, it's not a governmental track two, but it like kind of is some kind of like a corporate track two that maybe will involve governmental track two, and then start knitting together what we want to have as kind of a common agreement. And that, we might hope that those people would see the risks a little bit before the everyman in a small town, in America somewhere. And that they might be able to set some of the ground floor levels of international coordination just among themselves.
Yeah.
That's cool. I mean, I'm so curious if someone's working on that. If someone is, somebody please comment or email me or something, because I want to know if some of that is already happening. You know, we see like Daniel Kay leaving OpenAI and doing interviews, and there's, you know, Hinton famously left and now he's talking about it. I know Stuart Russell's trying to get a lot of deliberate coordinated efforts, but I like that idea. I guess closing, you know, in terms of your nutshell for people governing the tech, you've given them new things to think about here. Some things where maybe we might have a minute to think, other things where we've got new pressing concerns that people should really be aware of. What would you say for whether it's folks in the United Nations or maybe people trying to influence the Trump administration or whatever, more traditional politics stuff? What do you hope they take away from this conversation?
Yeah, so I guess I primarily try to understand the landscape of what's happening at the moment and where things are going, in order to illuminate that and just let other people draw their own lessons from that. That's what I see as my main role, as opposed to having particular policy asks.
That's great. No, I respect that. Totally respect that.
But in terms of policy asks, I think I don't have that much to say that's all that different to what other people will be saying. But I think that national governments, say that are developing AI, such as the US government, should be attempting to have transparency, like as in so that they can see what is being built by these companies. There were things like the voluntary commitments that were made under the last administration. I think that they need to be formalized into commitments that have to be met. And in order to understand what the cutting edge capabilities are of these systems. And they also need to be able to, I think, develop the powers, whether at a national level for companies below you or at an international level, to talk about the possibility of how could they have an immediate pause on things if it was needed. So at the moment, it's not clear what would happen if there was, say, some AI catastrophe or some very important whistleblowing or something like that. What levers could governments pull in order to actually pause development of these systems? And I think that they need to work out what they are, so they've got a kind of in case of break glass, in case of emergency break glass situation.
I like that. I've heard some rumblings of these kinds of ideas being conjured within other kind of think tanks, even within RAND from some conversations there. So I hope that more of that gets knitted together across the pond with China, of course, because it would have to be, and keeping those dialogues open, because I'm completely with you. I think some degree of break glass is good. But I think your purpose is served here, Toby. We unpacked a lot, and I think if people are actively in the policy or the AGI creation world, they've got new Lego pieces to play with to hopefully try to make this stuff go right. So I know that's all we have for time, but it's been a real pleasure. I'm very glad we were able to get in this interview, and thanks so much for being here.
Oh, it's been great. Thank you so much.
So that's all for this episode of The Trajectory. It's been a little bit since we've had an AGI Governance episode. This is part of, again, that same broad series with Connor Leahy and Yudkowsky and a bunch of others. I thought it'd be great to be able to loop in Toby to be able to sort of update us on where things are headed. I'll touch on a few of the sort of notes that came up for me over the course of the episode itself. First and foremost, as I mentioned, within the Precipice itself, there is some consideration around big picture wise, where is this all taking us in terms of the process of unfolding intelligence? And Toby himself sort of is pretty frank about there probably being something pretty important for sort of this big process to do. But he brings up a perspective that I'm very congenial with, and which I think is important as a meta theme for many of our interviews here, certainly in the Worthy Successor series, which is that it doesn't make sense to sort of cast off the flame of life away from humanity to some other torch if we don't know the qualities of that torch? Can it actually hold the flame? Can it expand the flame? Does it have the traits and qualities that are relevant, like sentience or kind of self-creation, or the other things we would see as relevant? So in that regard, I very much concur with his perspective. I think there are near-term things we've got to sort of reflect on, to use the Toby Ord long reflection sort of phrase here, before we start leaping into new substrates. In addition, I think it's useful that Toby is sort of looking at where the trends within AI development are going in terms of the requirements for power, in terms of the requirements for compute, the relative cost of certain kinds of productivity, and sort of bringing those trends to light to sort of help policymakers maybe think through which risks are more dire or maybe potentially less dire given the tech tree wing that we're starting to expand into. And he brought up a great analogy of, will we have a country of geniuses spun up in a data center or a company of geniuses spun up in a data center? You know, the difference between, millions of Einsteins and, 12 of them is pretty big. And he also talks about kind of the cost differentials there. Certainly no certainty shaken out of this episode, but I think just to be able to see where the trajectories are headed, I think is useful. And I think there is definitely a role for that in the broader AGI discourse, looking at where things are tilting and hopefully making smarter policy decisions. So I'm sure we'll have other AGI governance episodes into the future. This will be one of those series that continues to go on. It may not be the main star of the show like the Worthy Successor series, which you might see every couple weeks here. But AGI governance, obviously part of sort of getting this system right. And I think there's few other than Toby who've thought more about it, and I'm grateful I was able to have him here. So that's it for this episode. Without further ado, I'll wrap up and catch you next time here in The Trajectory.